Hello, it's Cave Cat again, here once more with episode 40 of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. I can hardly believe that we finally reached the proverbial number 40 in this review series. We've really come a long way, haven't we? Anyway, for today's episode, it's time to talk about another show that was produced by Jim Henson Productions, the first time I've done so since Muppet Babies. However, the show was actually spun off from a live-action special that was produced by Jim Henson's company as an episode of the Jim Henson Hour before it was commissioned to become an animated series. So what's the show? Dog City. This is an interesting one because aside from being produced by Jim Henson, the show was also produced in association with Nelvana. So yeah, this is actually the fifth time that I'm reviewing a Nelvana anime show, following the Magic School Bus, Beetlejuice, Family Dog, rather infamously I might add, and even Inspector Gadget, as well as this being the eighth time that I've reviewed a show or movie featuring a dog as the main character. So anyway, what is Dog City, you ask? Well, it's a combination live-action animated series that was produced for the Fox Kids Saturday morning block back in 1992, with it having been spun off from an hour-long special also called Dog City, as I've mentioned earlier. But anyway, it's time to get on with this review. To give a summary of the show as a whole, it follows two basic stories, one taking place in a live-action world inhabited by dog characters portrayed as puppets, courtesy of Jim Henson's company, of course, and another taking place in an animated world also inhabited by anthropomorphic dog characters. That's because the main character for the live-action puppet world is Elliot Shag, a German shepherd who works as an animator creating his own animated series, while the other main character for the animated world is Ace Hart, a German shepherd private detective. In each episode, Elliot is confronted by a problem while trying to work on his cartoon, whether it's being bullied and hassled by his bulldog superintendent Bruno, trying to win the affections of his collie love interest Colleen, interacting with his young neighbor Artie, etc. Also at the same time, Elliot finds himself creating and animating an Ace Hart story directly inspired by whatever event transpires around him. What follows after that is a police detective story involving Ace being called on the case to solve whatever crime is being committed by various villains. I really like the idea of an animated cartoon focusing on the concept of a cop show, but with dogs as the pivotal characters, as well as the occasional cat thrown in for good measure. While the show does focus on the animated exploits of Ace trying to solve the crime, we're also treated to occasional interludes back in the puppet world when something interrupts Elliot, or something else that a lot of shows, live action or animated, tend to do, breaking the fourth wall. The reason for this is because in each episode, in a rather near similar manner to that of Calvin and Hobbes, at certain points in the episode, whenever Elliot adds in a plot detail that doesn't sit well with Ace, the latter will actually speak to the former about how this detail doesn't seem right, and more often than not will convince Elliot to try and make the story more believable. This is because, unlike the other characters in the animated world, Ace knows that he's a cartoon character, so that means that he's more savvy to what's going on around him whenever Elliot is animating the stories. In a way, it's kind of like what happened in Duck Amuck or even Rabbit Rampage, but in a more positive portrayal. I wonder if the show might have been partially inspired by those two cartoons. Also, while the show does follow a lot of the different tropes that can be found in many police shows, the way that they put a canine spin on a lot of the episode plots is very creative and imaginative. One such example of this is in the very first episode entitled The Big Squeak, wherein Elliot animates a story where Ace has to solve a mystery involving the theft of various squeaky toys, where it's revealed that the canine crime lord Bugsy Vile and his goons have kidnapped a millionaire in the hopes that they could use a special squeaky toy to open his safe. It'll make more sense if you watch the episode. As I keep mentioning before in a lot of my reviews, the characters, both in the puppet world and in the animated world, all do a good job of playing off of each other with their own personalities and quirks. In the puppet world, we have Elliot, who is basically like the beleaguered straight man who has his own standards and practices when it comes to animating the cartoons that make up a bulk of the episode. Colleen is the love interest whom Elliot has an undisguised crush on. Bruno is the tough, no-nonsense building superintendent who has it out for Elliot. Bowser is the handyman who acts as Bruno's assistant, at the expense of being rather slow-witted. Miss Fluffet is the feline landlady who is often threatening to get Elliot thrown out of his apartment. Artie is Elliot's young neighbor who likes to visit Elliot, as well as also relaying some of his own problems to Elliot, and several other characters. The characters in the animated world are also based off the other puppet characters that Elliot interacts with. For the animated world, we have Ace Hart, who is the main character who does his part to solve the different crimes that have been perpetrated all over Dog City, as well as being quick witted and savvy to whatever Elliot animates around him, as mentioned earlier, while also being inspired by Elliot himself. Rosie O'Gravy is the beautiful chief of detectives who often assists Ace in the many different investigations while being inspired by Colleen. Addie is the young news pup who often tags along with Ace in trying to solve the mysteries, but more often than not always gets himself into trouble while being inspired by Artie, and who also reminds me of Fievel from the American Tail films, since he wears clothes similar to those of Fievel. He was voiced by the same kid who would later voice Ralphie in the Magic School Bus. The villains are also pretty neat characters as well, with Bugsy Vile being the ruthless crime boss while also being inspired by Bruno, Bruiser being the hulking yet dim-witted thug who is Bugsy's nephew while being inspired by Bowser. He kind of reminds me of Moose from the Archie comics, being that both characters are big, tough, and strong, but not too bright. Miss Kitty, who serves as Bugsy's mom while being inspired by Miss Fluffy, Frisky, who is basically the right-hand man with the Napoleon complex, and Mad Dog, who, as his name implies, is rather crazy and not quite right in the head, unless he receives a hit on the head, which causes him to start doing Shakespearean recitations. In fact, the very first episode actually had him say, "Wasn't it Shakespeare who wrote, 'Oh, what a tangled web we weave, when first we practice to deceive'?" There's also Baron von Rottweiler, who doesn't really appear as often as Bugsy Vile and his goons, but when he does, he's more depicted as being a German madman. He's also accompanied by his sidekick and valet, Leon Berger, who, despite his name, is not actually a Leon Berger, but rather a dachshund, yet he doesn't really speak for some reason. And no, that was not a dog pun, which is another thing I should talk about. Being that the show's about anthropomorphic dogs in a detective noir style setting, sometimes they'll throw in a dog pun that's just so groan worthy in a so bad it's good manner. Moving on, while the first season of the show is pretty good, the second and third seasons of the show is when things started to change. First off, starting with the second season, Colleen, who was Elliot's love interest and who served as the inspiration for Rosie O'Gravy, was completely dropped from the show for some unexplained reason. Instead, she was replaced with Terry Springer, who was Artie's mother and the new love interest for Elliot. Not only that, but we're also introduced to new characters in both seasons, such as Rosie's niece Dot, who doesn't really do anything of substance other than just constantly and annoyingly ask why, much like Mindy from the Mindy and Button segments from Animaniacs would later do. It's pretty funny the way I mention that, considering the fact that the second season of Dog City premiered the same year that Animaniacs first premiered on television. Another episode also introduces us to a canine superhero team known as the Wolf Pack, whom I believe are supposed to be parodying other superhero teams like the Justice League or even the Avengers. The third season also introduces Yves and Steven, a series of shorts involving Yves, a cat burglar who is quite literally a cat trying to commit some kind of crime, at the same time that a heroic dog security guard named Steven has to stop him, despite the fact that Steven isn't exactly all that bright and mainly ends up succeeding through complete luck, almost similar to what Hong Kong Phooey would do. Just what do I mean by shorts? Well, starting with the second season, aside from the episodes with Elliot animating stories featuring Ace Hart, we end up getting treated to a bunch of other side shorts, such as The Adventures of Rosie and Dot, which involves a rather flanderized Rosie along with Dot going through their own adventures, which are rather basic and very mediocre. The Wolf Pack, as mentioned before, which involves the members Watchdog, parody of Batman, Plastic Lassie, Pectoral Pooch, Here Boy, Get It, and Wonder Whelp, treating ordinary everyday tasks like they're a big deal. A short series focusing on Artie's toy rabbit, Mr. Mookie, and of course, Yves and Steven, as I mentioned before. These changes to the show don't seem to do any favors, mainly because all these shorts do is just take away from the main focus of having Elliot animating the main stories, featuring Ace solving the various crimes and mysteries. These shorts just constantly interrupt the main episode while adding nothing of substance to the plot. In fact, it's almost like what happened with Adventures from the Book of Virtues, when the third season of that show ended up completely meandering about in regards to actually trying to follow the format of the previous two seasons, which are still superior in my opinion, but just completely fails in trying to do so, due to the fact that it's been headed by a completely different team who just had no idea what it was that made the first two seasons of the show great in the first place. The second and third seasons of Dog City end up facing most of the exact same problems that the third season of Adventures from the Book of Virtues went through. Being denser and wackier in most of the episodes, the flanderization of some of the characters trying to tell very basic stories thanks to the side shorts, and also stretching out some of the jokes too far. It's like the show was trying to ape itself as a sketch comedy series in its second and third season, much like Animaniacs or even the 1980s Garbage Pail Kids cartoon. But unlike the latter two shows, the sketch comedy format does not fit with Dog City at all. I'm sorry to say this, but after what I just said about the show so far, I'm afraid that it ends up getting 6 stars. It's pretty sad to think that ever since Jim Henson's death back in 1990, the quality of a lot of Muppet projects produced by his company weren't just up to snuff as they were when he was alive. And even though his son Brian Henson tried to follow in his father's footsteps to try and copy his father's vision, he still did a pretty decent job, but not quite as good as Jim did before. Dog City the series is definitely one of the Muppet projects to fall under this, even though there were some later shows produced by Jim Henson Productions that were pretty good, like Dinosaurs, The Wubbulous World of Dr. Seuss, Bear in the Big Blue House, and even Dinosaur Train. Of course, there are also some other shows that are just nothing but kiddie fare, like Sid the Science Kid and Word Party, since those shows are more aimed for preschool audiences. Even in spite of the unfortunate death of Jim Henson, at least his legacy is kept alive thanks to Brian Henson, and especially the fact that the Muppets are still being used in a lot of shows and movies, though at a rather minimal rate. And don't even get me started on the current state of Sesame Street. Well, people, that wraps up this episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. Once more, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more episodes, or something else. So until next time, see you in the future.